symposium or the plenary. So the next speaker is Bert Fabian. And he's in the Transport Program Manager of the Clean Air Initiative of Asian Cities, centered in Manila, which aims to promote better air quality and livable cities by translating knowledge to policy and action to reduce air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions. He takes the lead in managing and developing transport-related projects, and conducts research and analyses on issues related to transportation, environment, and urban planning. Bert, please give us a 10-minute introduction. Thank you.
Yeah, good morning, and sorry again for the delay, but some of these things we cannot avoid. Anyway, I will just start on and discuss, and let's see how far I get, and if there are questions later on, and then we can take the questions as well. I'm afraid my presentation would be a bit grimmer than what we heard from Professor Peter Newman, but I will try to make it a bit more hopeful. This is what I plan to cover, and it's a lot of slides, but I think I will just focus on some of the key issues. Yeah, the organization, you can read all about it, but basically at that time when it was established by ADB, World Bank, and USAID, there was this kind of gap, and air pollution was a major issue. And up to now, it is still a major issue, and despite this effort that many organizations have put together, Asia is a very big region, and there are not that many who are developing as fast as they could, like what we have in Singapore and many Chinese cities. And it still paints a grim picture in terms of air pollution and now, of course, greenhouse gas emissions as well. And hence the organization was established, focusing on these four major areas: air quality and climate change, clean fuels and vehicles, green freight and logistics, and of course what they are now calling low emissions urban development. And I don't need to elaborate. Most of the development are in Asia, and the major cities will be present here. And of course, along with this, you will realize that it's all about increasing consumption of almost all of our resources. And it's about electricity and the translated emissions coming out of this, like CO2, SO2. And in several cases, there are many countries, especially in China and India, and even in the Southeast Asia. In the past, it was more about electricity generation from hydro sources or geothermal. And now, of course, demand is outstripping the supply of energy, and hence we are now building more again of the power plants, and which is powered by coal. The story, I believe Professor Newman has also elaborated on this, is about motorization. And many of these countries and cities have increasing economy, and most of the middle income are growing in terms of having the desire to own their vehicles and to use it. And hence this is the trend as compared to other parts of the world. When we did this small research in the past together with Lee Schipper, who was really our guru and has invested most of his time looking at these issues in terms of numbers, we just looked at the trends in several of these countries. And of course, CO2 is directly proportional to growing combustion or to combustion of fuel, and hence this is the picture. And of course, the two major countries that are standing out are India and China. But of course, China has also achieved a lot over the past 10 years. But despite that, demand for vehicles and use of vehicles are still growing. It's a different story when you talk about particulate matter emissions. These are based on decisions by governments and also the actual experience when they move beyond Euro 1 standards, Euro 2 equivalent standards, I would say, because in some countries it's not really Euro standards. In India it's called Bharat. In China it's called China 1, China 2, 3, 4. And this analysis, it's based on that, the countries are moving towards Euro 4 equivalent standards by a certain time. And of course, just because of the growing number of vehicles, even if the governments are successful in adopting stricter vehicle standards or vehicle emission standards, it will still go up because of the growing vehicles. And of course, and what we saw, what is happening still, there are many cities who are still way below the air quality guidelines brought about or prescribed by the WHO. And we're not talking about 100 micrograms over. Some of these cities are even 150 micrograms over the air quality guidelines prescribed by WHO. I promised Lydia also that I was going to try to speak about this indoor and outdoor. There are a lot of literature happening on this. This is one of the researches that was conducted by professors in Hong Kong together with people in Sri Lanka or in Colombo, when they looked at this interaction or at least influence of indoor and outdoor air quality. And these are some of the results of their study, which was presented in our last conference in BAQ 2010 in Singapore. And well, these are the actual data that they have gathered, testing several of these parameters in houses in Colombo. And you will just probably, if to highlight something, definitely there is this 30% influence in terms of PM10 concentrations in households. But you will realize that the PM10 concentrations that we're talking about ranges from 130 or 120 to 180 micrograms per cubic meter. And again, to emphasize, WHO's prescription is 20 micrograms per cubic meter. And I believe there will be presentations later on, and perhaps they can elaborate on these guidelines. Another key finding that they got was in terms of the decrease in the number of the concentrations as you got farther away from the road. I should emphasize that the Health Effects Institute, which is based in Boston in the US, they recently, or 2 years ago, they came up with this study that all of the people living within 500 meters of major thoroughfares in Asian countries, or usually Asian cities, sorry, are more prone to the effects of PM10. And again, even with this finding, I think they have found out the same thing, but they have at least quantified and again saw that the indoor and outdoor concentrations in the homes and outside. There will be I will try to do it to continue in the next slides for 2 or 3 minutes, and then at least we can have some questions. Then all of these issues started to come together, and 5 years ago we were still inside the Asian Development Bank. All donor organizations and all efforts by the international community shifted towards climate change. And I would even say it distorted the picture, because the international community are now talking about CO2. And unfortunately, we have not yet solved the air pollution problem. And countries and cities and the international community are going now away and focusing on the issue of CO2. At that time, we were struggling in terms of the organization to see how we can bring back the air pollution agenda into the discussions. And hence, we tried to do more research to link the two together. And we're happy that at least in the IPCC, they also realize that the drivers are the same thing in terms of CO2 emissions as well as air pollution. And hence, it should be treated together. And like this graph emphasizes the relationship of CO2 emissions per capita and also particulate matter emissions. As you go down, like you have the smaller cities. And here, like I just recalled that Professor Newman also emphasized denser cities. Like all of these cities, Delhi, Mumbai, Bangalore, Kolkata, and even if you go down at the medium-sized levels, are very high dense. We should again emphasize that these are already very high dense cities. Of course, you will have the highest density would be Tokyo, but all of these major cities, even in Southeast Asia, Bangkok, Manila, Jakarta, are already very dense. So there is a problem that we need to solve. And it's not about making the cities, at least in these major economies, still denser, but just trying to put in like adequate public transport services, bring back walking and cycling, and go beyond the private motorization use. I think I will not be able to properly show this. This is a new report or study that we're working on together with a Canadian firm called Trion. And the argument basically is just to see how we can discuss with authorities how we can help them see or at least visualize the impact of development, meaning the land uses, the footprints of buildings, their uses in terms of emissions. And we are developing this methodology together with this organization, and hopefully in the next months we will be able to publish this. The short process is like we start off from GIS, like all of the building land uses, as I said, and then put in analysis using basically the ASIF framework, which talks about trips, transport, fuel, electricity, and emission factors, and come up with analysis on what is the emissions in terms of CO2, or sorry, first the fuel use, and then equate it with the emissions in terms of CO2 and particulate matter and NOx, and it is linked to the gross building areas and the building categories. And this is the shortly or briefly what we're doing in terms of electricity fuel use in buildings. I realize that you will have many questions, and I think I can answer those later. When finished, it will be free, like almost all of our methodologies. One of our methodologies is called Transportation Emissions Evaluation Model for Projects. It has been adopted by Jeff, the Global Environment Facility. It's online, it's all free, and we can provide help or at least answer your questions if you have some. And this is again the same. But basically, when we were doing this, the argument of ADB is it's very difficult to ask the donor community or the multilateral development banks when discussing with the city authorities what they want to do with your city. A quick analysis would be 1 year. This is a proper analysis, at least I think 1 year, because you should have a decent OD matrix or OD origin destination survey that really encapsulates or captures the picture. And ADB was asking us whether we can try to figure out, like, it's not perfect, it's not accurate, but at least to see what is the current situation, the impact in terms of the baseline scenario, and then what we call what-if scenarios, like the business as usual if the trends continue, and what is called the low-carbon resilience scenario. And I will not elaborate. These are results from Ho Chi Minh, and we have results in terms of the baseline as compared to the 2030 business as usual and the low-carbon and resilient. And it has information on CO2, particulate matter, and NOx, and other parameters. And we are still finalizing this. These are draft or interim results, but this is what we're trying to see. Basically, like, again, the colors, it was already told to us when I presented this the last time, the colors doesn't really help, so we should try to modify it. But the point is, like, there should be some mechanism, like what I emphasized, for city authorities to visualize where is the problem in the city, and then how can you deal with it. And similarly for building electricity use. Yeah, I think we can stop here, and although there are only a few slides, but I think we can have further interaction later. The Colombo results will be similar to Ho Chi Minh, and
very much. Oh, thank you very much. And please stay with